I'm Femi OK. Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls is hearing from victims' family members this week, and they're demanding justice for their loved ones.
But first, the Canadian government has settled with some Indigenous survivors of a controversial policy known as the Sixties Scoop. I'm Ahmed Shabuddin. That's today on the stream, live on YouTube.
The Sixties Scoop was a Canadian government assimilation policy from the 1950s to 1990s, where Native children were taken from their homes and resettled with white families. These children were often not allowed to speak their language, did not have access to their families, and were stripped of their culture. Have a listen to one survivor.
It was a direct attempt to try to take the Indian out of the Indian. While I was raised in a family that supported me to be Indian, a lot of things that were taken away from me, such as language, the culture, not fitting in, the ridicule, substance abuse, there's a number of things. So in a way, I kind of feel that the 60 Scoop has kind of won, because I'm still struggling with a lot of those issues that I just talked about, and taking steps in trying to come back to who I am and where I belong, and that whole idea about coming full circle again, coming back to, you know, what I'm supposed to be, where I'm supposed to be. And even though I am a grown man, I feel like just a youth, a boy. I still struggle with it. I still feel like a boy who's just kind of, you know, sometimes just walking alone.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that mending the relationship with Indigenous communities is a priority. The $600 million settlement is part of a larger process of truth and reconciliation that began back in 2008.
That these are essential elements to begin to right the wrongs of this dark and painful chapter, the 60s Scoop.
We reached out to the office of the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, but they declined to join the programme. Joining us for more, Pamela Pometer is Associate Professor and Chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University in Toronto. In Toronto, Comrade Prince is a 60 Scoop survivor and Director of Indigenous and Native Programmes with Save the Children Canada. Pam, Comrade, good to have you here. Comrade, usually when you share family pictures, they're lovely. But when I am sharing your pictures, they mean so much more. I have 4 here. Talk us through what's happening and who we're seeing, why it's important.
Well, that picture there is my first embrace of my mom in 2000. And that was after about a decade-long search in trying to find her after I left my adopted home. So that actually picture, she's whispering in my ear that everything is going to be okay now.
When was the last time your mum saw you before this picture?
Just right before my first birthday, I was taken from her and adopted out to a non-Aboriginal family, and then given back to CAS Child Welfare, and then readopted back out. Thank God, I guess, that the first family kept their receipt for me, so they returned me. And then I was actually shipped to Germany. I was adopted into a military family.
I'm just trying to think physically, what was going on with your body, your stomach, your head, your mind? And you hadn't seen your mother since you were 1, and you've been looking for her.
It was a culmination of years and years and years of dreaming about her. I used to be able to dream. I could feel her, I could smell her, everything when I was a kid. And, you know, I've never had any other feeling, not even when I when I saw the welcoming of my sons into the world, the same type of feeling of embracing my mom. I think fundamentally, you know, we all as human beings want to find out, you know, where we come from, and you know, embracing my mom was I don't know, it's hard to describe.
Sure. I'm sure some of our audience are crying now. Let me see if I can cheer them up. Broad smiles with this picture. Who's in this pic?
That's actually my cousin, and she's my spiritual grounder. She actually helped me repatriate my family back to my community. She speaks Ojibwe. I promised I will one day learn, but it's hard because you kind of have to balance between like the life that you were leading and then trying to recapture and recover everything that was taken from you. But she's my spiritual guide now. She helped me with the challenge of when my mother passed away, and I was given the responsibility of taking all my uncles and my mom back to Saugeen in Manitoba, and to do it in a way that is consistent with our way of being and knowing, and there's some particular cultural protocols, and she definitely helped me with that.
Well, you know, as you were talking there, Conrad, I couldn't help but think, Lou Jobs is chiming in on Twitter here. There's so many different people who are trying to highlight different aspects of this, the sadness. And I don't want to bring people back and depress them as we did at the beginning, but it's, you know, a serious topic. Lou Jobs saying people still believe that taking our kids is deserved, that we are bad parents, that somehow we don't love our children. I was wondering if there's anything you can comment about in terms of that perception. Can you relate to that?
Yeah, I mean, the state, the federal government created the conditions that made what they believe made it right to take us away, and that came from on the heels of the residential school system. So that system decimated our families through abusing you know, children in the residential school systems. And when they came to be adults, they were challenged with all their experiences. So with them offloading, the federal government offloading the responsibility of Indigenous children to the provinces, it actually created a financial incentive. A financial incentive actually that we're still dealing with today as a perverse incentive to take kids away. So I think that there's a huge misconception out there in relation to the 60s Swoop. And the 60s Swoop actually connotes that this incentive, along with the decimation of our communities and families, and they literally, CAS workers came in and with the help of some RCMP at times, taking kids from the embrace of our parents, and in hospitals just waiting, you know, as kids were born. So there's a lot of misconceptions. I'm encouraged that, you know, this issue is being raised inside Canada to bring awareness to that, and I'm appreciative that actually it's going to get some international coverage, because there's a huge context here of, and I'll leave it to Pam to speak to it insofar as, you know, Canada is internationally known as a human rights advocate, yet not very many people out there internationally realize that it's actually a human rights abuser. And, you know, Obama came to Canada in this last year and stated that the world needs more of Canada. And from the Indigenous perspective, I would argue, you know, dramatically against that, saying the world actually needs less of the world.
Let me just bring Pamela in here. Pamela, let me just show our audience here. This is on the Government of Canada site, a 60s Scoop agreement in principle. And the Government of Canada says this is the first step in resolving the 60s Scoop litigation. So we heard one story out of so many of youngsters who were taken away from their families. And the government are going to do what now, Pamela?
Well, they're going to try to resolve the pieces of litigation that were started in different provinces by literally thousands of survivors, those who actually survived the experience, because there's countless thousands who didn't survive the 60s scoop. And so they're trying to resolve that very quickly at a very low price, but they've also, in so doing, are trying to exclude thousands of others from being able to partake in this settlement. So they're not really engaged in a good faith settlement process here. And keep in mind that the whole concept of the 60s scoop is really a misnomer. There are more kids today in foster care than there were during residential schools and even during the 1960s and 70s.
Pamela.
In the last 10 years alone, it's increased by 85% in some provinces. So this hasn't stopped. Settling this litigation doesn't address the stopping of stealing our children.
Most definitely. And Pamela, I'm glad you brought that point up. We have a tweet here. Oh, I just lost it. Well, there was a tweet that was talking about how this is still going on. You know, the 60s scoop is still going on. And we have another video comment kind of running with that same narrative from Blake, who kind of shares another personal story to kind of highlight the chronic abuse that continues and what he calls the absence of justice. Take a listen.
The absence of justice for the Métis survivors of the 60s scoop is another atrocity to the 60s scoop itself. The Canadian government has just announced the settlement for First Nations and Inuit while actively excluding the Métis populations. I am an intergenerational survivor of the 60s scoop from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement, one of 8 Métis communities of northern Canada. Essentially what's happened is I was able to live the rest of my entire life in the Fishing Lake Métis community, something that was not afforded to my biological mother, Brenda, who is not a survivor of the 60s scoop. I'm in a position that is unique because I know what it's like to be raised in community and how healthy that is for young Indigenous minds and young Indigenous peoples such as myself. So what I'm calling for is asking for nothing more than what's already ours, and that's justice.
Pamela, your thoughts? There's the tweet, by the way, I was referring to. The scoop still happening, just called a different name, Children's Services. What do you make of that comment we heard from Blake?
Well, it's true. So the settlement, at least what they're reporting, is that they're excluding anyone who's Métis and literally thousands of Indigenous peoples who are not registered under the Indian Act. So that means there's going to be thousands of non-status Indians who don't get to partake in this. Now, keep in mind, what this is doing is using literally decades of racism and discrimination that's caught up in the Indian Act against the very survivors who were victims of both Indian Act discrimination and now this 60s scoop, which, like I said, is really a misnomer. It's an ongoing scoop. And here's what the implications are. This isn't just about the loss of language, culture, and identity. It is the root cause of depression and suicide in our communities. Suicide is the #1 cause of death in youth, and it's literally a pipeline to being human trafficking, exploited, prison, and murdered and missing Indigenous women, which we'll be talking about a little later. So their failure to stop is literally killing our people.
I'm going to say thank you to Comrade Prince. Thank you, Comrade, so much for sharing your family story and your greater view on what's happening with this settlement process in Canada right now. And Ahmed, there's so much going on around this truth and reconciliation process in Canada, especially online. What are you seeing? Yeah,
very complex, very emotional problem that people are trying to address. Canadians have been using the hashtag 60s Scoop online to share these stories about survivors. Here's one, for example, a picture of Zachary taken from his family at age 8 in Manitoba. He asks, did you ever stop and wonder, where did all these children go? Here's an old advertisement for adopting an Indigenous baby, Ellen or Little Miss Eskimo, typical, really, of advertisements of that time for Indigenous babies. Some were also wondering if after the so-called 60s Scoop settlement, similar suits would follow in the U.S. Hashtag MMIWG, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, is being used to talk about the hearings that have just started in Winnipeg. And survivors will be sharing their personal stories about loved ones that are missing or were killed with commissioners from the National Inquiry that's visiting. This is the third such hearing in Canada since the commission was formed to look into the approximately 1,200 missing women and girls. Now, despite the hearing, a growing number of people online and families affected are signing a petition asking Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to reset the inquiry and start over.
So joining us for more on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we have Maggie Sywink. She is a special advisor to the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General, but she's speaking today in a personal capacity as a surviving family member of Sonia Sywink, who was murdered in 1994. Maggie, you must hear so many family stories about what happened to their loved ones. I'm going to play you another one and ask you, where does this fit in? What is the big issue, the ongoing issue in Canada? This is Tessa Mclean. This is the story she shared with us.
My cousin was murdered 3 years ago, about 3 years and 2 weeks ago to this day. And I would consider my family to be survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I just wanted to share that as survivors, it's been, living afterwards has been pretty traumatic. And we actually had a chance to know who the killer was, so we have that type of closure. But when it was time to sentence the killer of my cousin, I felt like Canada didn't care. When we were sentencing him, the Crown was to sentence him, and the Crown didn't have time to listen to our testimonies or to hear who our cousin was. And I was seeking the maximum punishment for him, and unfortunately I feel that Canada has just way too many MMIWG cases that they don't have time to truly consider how Native people are affected by this issue.
Tessa's not alone, Maggie. So many families feel exactly the same way. What is it about this relationship between the Indigenous communities in Canada and authorities, the government, police?
It's so long stemmed. It dates back centuries, actually. So I don't know, honestly, what the real fix is, but I know that what this young lady, Tessa, is saying is certainly not unique, because there's a common thread that runs through all of this. There is this lack of acknowledgement with our stories and who our loved ones have been, what their life was, what they meant to us. I think that is not something that is really known throughout the Indigenous communities as well as around Canada.
So Pamela, there is this national inquiry. We actually did ask any members of the national inquiry, can you come on the show? And we reached out to them, they didn't respond to us. How is this inquiry going?
Well, you get the same response that the vast majority of us get. Numerous people in the Canadian media, in First Nations, and in civil society groups, women's organizations, and families have the same problem. There has been ongoing lack of action, lack of communication, to such an extent that the United Nations even issued a report to Canada saying they have grave concerns about the lack of accountability and communication that's going on in this inquiry. And it's now gotten to such a mess, such a terrible extent that it's acted in an adversarial nature in trying to defend itself and divided families. So you now have families who really want to participate in this inquiry and give their testimony, and others who are saying that the inquiry is not doing them justice. It's excluding lots of families, it's not paying for them to be part of this, it's not supporting the women's organizations and other government non-government organizations to participate. And you have mass resignations, the resignation of a commissioner. It's the biggest mess we've ever seen in any kind of commission or inquiry in Canada, yet the government continues not to step in and clean up this mess, because the lives of Indigenous women and girls continue to be at threat on a daily basis. Not only do they not take action on the ground,
right,
but they're allowing this inquiry to literally implode before our eyes.
I'd like to break in here, Pam, and I think that last week you did hashtag something that says silence is violence.
Yes.
And when that came out, what resonated with me was the fact that there are so many families, so many survivors of violence who just don't have enough energy, they don't have enough, they know it's causing them so much harm that they're just on the fence. They don't want to participate or even be close to the inquiry, and it's really a tragedy in itself.
And you know, when you talk about people participating, I would be remiss not to bring up these tweets. Sarah Scout saying, talking about Canadians, not just the government, I think Canadians tend to claim they know and love everything about their country, but they speak from a place of settler privilege. Now, that's one comment. We have another one here saying it's not taught much in schools. There's still lots of hate towards Indigenous here. Lots think this is a handout. And you know, I want to ask you, Pam, when we talk about that inquiry, when we talk about what's happening, what the government is doing, I want to kind of play another comment from Tessa that really highlights maybe what the government could be doing to really be giving equal opportunity for this community to have a voice. Take a listen.
Another issue that I have with the inquiry is that when they were hiring, when they launched that they were hiring, they put up standards such as being able to speak English and French. Well, that eliminates almost all Native women from participating in the inquiry. So this inquiry is non-Native led, and the voice of Native women on the inquiry team is not heard. So I just think that Canada, you could still try harder, you know, to make sure that you capture Native women voices, Native women perspectives, Native family perspectives.
Pam, it seems like a fair criticism there. If they want to have their voices, I mean, maybe take away that hurdle.
Yeah, exactly. There's no reason on earth why the Inuit didn't have an Inuit commissioner on there. There's no reason why families didn't have much greater input onto who they wanted to be on that inquiry. And if you look at the commissioners that are there, they have no background in advocacy for murdered and missing Indigenous women or working on all of the issues that are interrelated, because this is part of the problem. And so despite promises by Canada that we would be able to jointly draft the terms of reference and jointly pick those commissioners, we have a terms of reference that literally protects the police from any kind of serious investigation, which means we won't be actually dealing with the problem. All right, Pam, let me just bring this personal down to a personal level. Maggie, the reason why you're here, the reason why you do the work you do is because of your sister. Your sister, you lost your sister on this beautiful website here, shadesooursisters.com. You will see Sonia's story. How does what happened to her help you do the work that you do?
Well, you know, it really it's very important that I think I myself understand that my own healing depends on myself. I can't say this enough, that this inquiry will not bring me any healing. And when families begin to grasp that concept and be able to take the steps necessary for their own healing process, I think that it'll come quicker and it'll be much more foundational for families to find that for themselves. Part of the issue is that my sister was murdered in 1994. So that was 23 years ago. And I've done a lot of work. You know, it takes a lot of hard work to be able to find a place where you find your balance. And I don't think the tools have been available for families to actually have that. And so we need to make this Indigenous-led, community-driven.
About you.
About community, about families. I keep hearing the word government all over this conversation today, and I want to hear less government and more about families.
It's almost like, Ahmed, you've read this headline from the CBC. Supposed to be our inquiry, family members sheds MMIWG commission during testimony, literally coming in the last couple of hours.
You know, when you talk about it being about people, you talk about healing. Exactly. I mean, there's this quote from Amy Smoke kind of saying, at least there's hope. It gives me hope that people are paying attention, want to help actively participate, awareness for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and that is what's so crucial in reconciliation.
Maggie, Pamela and Conrad from early on in our programme, thank you so much for sharing your stories, your insights and your experiences as well. As always, our conversation continues online. Use the hashtag AJStream. Thanks for watching.